Russia is increasing its military spending in response to the war in Ukraine, but the country is on the verge of economic bankruptcy. Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin's decisions are plunging Russia into a serious downturn. The economic data reveal Russia's near collapse in a tangible way. Russia was once considered one of the strongest economies, but after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Russia has had to face severe problems. Let's take a closer look at how Putin's decisions have pushed the Russian economy to the brink of bankruptcy. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to be informed about our content. 2.5 years after Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian economy looks like a riddle wrapped in a conundrum of competing narratives. If you want to argue that the economy has been crippled by Western sanctions, the Kremlin's prioritization of military spending above all else, and Ukraine's successful drone strikes on Russian oil refineries, you can find plenty of evidence to support your view. Sanctions have indeed hurt the Russian economy, and Ukraine's drone strikes have indeed caused disruptions. The first blow was the escalation of sanctions and the shutdown of the world's giant automobile and technology companies in Russia. Then, the sanctions on the supply of spare parts in all areas dealt a very serious blow not only to the Russian economy, but also to the Russian defense industry production. The Russian army was at war and suffering heavy losses. It is very difficult to manage a war economy. For this, it had to increase production. But as a side effect, it faced a labor shortage. Although Russia was a self-sufficient country in many areas until the last 50 years, developing technology and growing economic systems had made the Russian Federation, like every country, dependent on foreign countries in many areas. The situation was becoming increasingly dire for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. While the Ukrainian army was constantly replenishing its modern Western equipment with aid, the Russian army had started a very intensive wartime production to compensate for its losses. However, this left Russia with a massive labor shortage. According to December 2023 data, the Russian Federation had a labor shortage of 4.8 million. On the other hand, the rise in foreign exchange rates and the fact that even Chinese banks did not favor relations with Russia was a great disappointment for Vladimir Putin. This troubled period grew very fast for Russia. More than half of the Russian nation is below the poverty line, and inflation and many other problems have erupted. From a long-term perspective, the economy is moving backwards in many sectors, and the recently announced dramatic increase in war spending is clearly unsustainable in the long run. An economy in serious trouble will have high unemployment and high inflation. Annual inflation in Russia this year is close to 10%, which is higher than in any developed economy. In this inflationary environment, it is interesting that the key interest rate of the Russian central bank has recently risen to 19%. The reason for the unusual divergence between the policy rate and the inflation rate is the growing volume of subsidized loans that the government is using to support military production. Such subsidies are effectively a transfer of taxpayers' wealth to the owners of military-industrial enterprises, Putin's friends. This data explains why Russian oligarchs are fleeing the country. The country is still planning to increase military spending. Russia's 2025 budget shows a sharp increase in military spending, with an expected increase of about 30%. This would bring Russia's defense budget to about $145 billion, up $32 billion from the previous year. Russia clearly has no intention of scaling back its military efforts. While the numbers are eye-catching, what really stands out is the portion of each country's budget devoted to military spending. Russia's 2025 budget is expected to devote about 32% of total government spending to national defense, amounting to roughly 13.5 trillion rubles, or $145 billion. This marks a significant increase in military spending, up 25% from the previous year. When combined with the security apparatus, including agencies such as the FSB, The total allocation could reach around 41% of the budget. In GDP terms, this defense and security spending would amount to around 6.3%, one of the highest levels since the Cold War. These figures evoke memories of the late Soviet era, when similarly high levels of military spending during the Cold War and the war in Afghanistan put severe economic pressure on the country and contributed to its eventual collapse. Russia's percentage ranks it potentially as the world's second and even largest spender when measured by GDP. By contrast, the United States has a defense budget of roughly 3.4% of its GDP, despite spending 9 times as much as Russia in absolute terms on military aid to Ukraine. This comparison highlights how much pressure Russia is putting on its economy to keep up with its military ambitions. The impact of such heavy military spending on the Russian economy runs deep. According to the International Monetary Fund, despite this heavy spending, the Russian economy is still showing signs of growth. However, this growth is somewhat misleading and is largely due to the country's declining population. With fewer people in the labor force, the government has had to hire more workers, not only for military service, but also to support key sectors such as factories producing drones and other essential services such as policing and market operations. This creates a paradox. That is, the economy may appear to be growing, but below the surface demographic and economic pressures are rapidly intensifying. This strategy brings to mind the Great Depression in the United States during the Second World War, when massive government spending helped stimulate the economy. But Russia's situation is very different. Unlike the United States, which used wartime spending to boost its post-war economy, Russia's prolonged military spending risks plunging the country into economic instability and possibly hyperinflation, as we are beginning to see in recent trends. The State Bank of Russia is struggling to control these rising prices as the government's continued spending outpaces its efforts to manage inflation. This situation is further complicated by shortages of manpower and materials needed to keep both the military and civilian sectors running. The practical consequences of this economic strain are evident in the daily lives of Russian citizens. For example, the government's purchase of food rations for soldiers competes directly with the availability of food for the general population. This shortage drives up prices and places an additional financial burden on ordinary Russians, who now have to spend more to buy the same necessities. The cost of food, fuel, and other basic goods has increased, making everyday life more expensive and further reducing the purchasing power of the average Russian worker. This creates a vicious circle in which increased military spending leads to higher inflation, which in turn forces the government to spend more to maintain its military and security apparatus, perpetuating economic instability. Moreover, the rising cost of living, coupled with stagnant or declining wages, makes military service a more attractive option for many Russians. In an economy where civilian employment opportunities are dwindling and wages are not keeping pace with inflation, the Russian military offers a stable income, housing, healthcare, and food for soldiers and their families. This shift in the labor force puts extra pressure on the civilian workforce, as factories and key industries struggle to retain employees interested in the better benefits military service offers. Higher military wages contribute to the wage price spiral and push inflation higher, as businesses need to raise their own wages to attract and retain workers. But the wage price spiral is particularly dangerous because it could potentially lead to hyperinflation, reminiscent of the 1990s, when Russia's inflation rates exceeded 2,000%. Current trends suggest that without significant intervention, Russia could be heading towards another severe inflationary crisis that threatens both its economy and its military power. The government's inability to rein in military spending despite rising costs and increasing economic pressure raises serious concerns about how sustainable this path really is. Complicating matters further, even the Russian military has expressed concerns about the long-term feasibility of maintaining such high levels of spending, while officials question whether the war in Ukraine can continue without major adjustments in fiscal policy. Beyond economic problems, Russia's military approach in Ukraine is plagued by serious operational challenges. Despite a significant increase in military spending, there is little evidence that Russia has gained a decisive advantage on the ground. Ukrainian forces, with strong Western support and high morale, continue to effectively counter Russia's advance. Russia's economic distress is likely to lead to logistical problems, supply shortages, and a reduced ability to sustain long-term military campaigns. In short, while Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin has decided to invest more in military spending in order to strengthen his military, this strategy is likely to plunge Russia into an economic quagmire far deeper than the quagmire of the former Soviet era. Thank you for following us.